there and welcome back. Well, you found this, the third in a series of videos where I'm breaking down an orchestral work that I've been working on and at the same time using the opportunity to show you how I put such a thing together. So far in video 1 we looked at creating the story, plotting sections or movements if you will, creating moods by making decisions on key, tempo and style, creating a melody and developing musical ideas. In the second video we looked at some basic music theory, the non-scary kind as I would like to think, and how chords can easily be identified, especially if you're new to this type of work. We looked at some basics on how different instruments complement each other and a look at the libraries that I have used. In this video then we are going to look at the template I use, which enables me to start working quickly, and we'll start to break down some of the passages of the work I'm using to demonstrate and how the sketch becomes the final sound. If you haven't done so already, please do subscribe so you can be updated when further videos are uploaded, and do please keep sending in your questions. Okay then, let's make a start and a quick look at templates. What is a template? Well, in simple terms, it is a pre-prepared project with all the instruments, the routing and tracks you regularly use that enables you to start recording and composing quickly and avoids you having to set up the instruments in your recording software each time you want to start writing. Now, you may wish to take a look at this video, which goes into much more detail on templates and how I use them. But here I just want to cover the basics of what I'm trying to achieve by having a template. Let me start by saying I'm very aware that not all people use templates. I've just found it so incredibly easy. You can be put off perhaps by reports that it takes such a long time to load. Well, they do if you're going to load all your libraries. But do you use all your libraries and all the samples on all your libraries all the time? No, of course you don't. Now, if you're just starting out on this type of music and work, you won't have a huge amount of orchestral libraries anyway. So you may have a handful of smaller ones that you're starting to use. The idea of a template is to have all those sounds, those library sounds or samples as they're called, loaded in the template already. You don't have to have the entire library loaded, as I say. You'll soon find that when you start using these samples, you'll end up using more or less the same samples in your recording, and not every sample that has been supplied in the library that you have bought. Yes? Yeah. So, start by making some decisions on what samples you need to include in your template. The reason I say this is that the version of your digital audio workstation or DAW will limit the amount of tracks for your samples in some way. Only when you have the full version of your DAW, or the Pro version as it's sometimes called, will you be able to include all your samples. So please bear that in mind when you start to put your template together for the first time. Some ask whether your template should use track instruments or rack instruments. If you're unsure what this means, do take a look at the video on orchestral templates where all that is explained in much more detail. I tend to use track instruments. So let's take a brief look at my template. So this is my template, and for those of you that use Cubase, you might have identified straight away, yes, that is a Cubase interface. What I want to emphasize more than anything else is the use of folders. Now, no matter what DAW version you use, I believe that they all will have folder tracks. And as we're working in orchestral music, I like to put the sections of the orchestra into their own folder, and then with each of those folders becomes the library. So let me just explain. So here in color-coded blue, I have the Winds folder or Woodwinds folder. If I open that, you can see we've then got 3 other folders. And those 3 folders are the names of the libraries that I'm using at the moment. I've got Albion, which is Spitfire's Albion 1. I've got BBC Symphony Orchestra, that's the core version of BBC SO. And I've got Project Sam's Swing. If we're to open each of these, you'll see that then we have the names of the particular samples. And of course, if you watched video 2 in this series, you'd see when I was working through the libraries that I use that Albion doesn't have flutes and it doesn't have clarinets. It has woodwinds highs, longs, shorts, woodwinds lows, long, shorts, etc. Now you may also notice here that the Albion low long is highlighted where the Albion low short in this example isn't. That's because that sample has already been loaded. And to unload it, to save RAM of course, I've put a key switch, and I think I use D, which is disable. I'll also use the same key switch, D, to enable. So highlight it, and there we have the Albion's high arranged shorts. Apologies again for my noisy keyboard I'm using. Now, I'm very aware that not all DAWs have this facility. I think, well, I know obviously Cubase has it. I think Logic has it as well, if I'm honest. But this is one of the keys to having as many tracks and samples in your template as possible. And that is the key to making sure that you can just keep adding tracks, no problem, with the pro versions of these DAWs, of course. You're not worried about waiting for 5, 10, 15, 30 minutes for a template to open up, because none of the samples are loaded in the template itself. So you only start to use the actual samples that you want when you want them. If we just, bear with me. Let me just close that folder, and then we will look at the brass. Same again, Albion, BBC Symphony Orchestra, and if we open one of those folders, we'll get folders with the various samples. There's the trumpets, for instance. Similarly, we go down to, I like to put keys in a separate folder, even though I've got things like a harp in the keys folder. Don't ask me why, I don't know. Percussion, and finally strings I have in green. And having all these color coordinated, the colors don't mean anything at all particularly, but they do help when you've got multiple tracks in one piece. It enables you, for instance, if I'm looking for strings, I'm just looking for the green all the time. It really is quite useful. And then towards the bottom, I think I've got a folder with some guitars. So for instance, I've got a 12-string strummed acoustic guitar there. Press D to load it up, and straight away I've got access to the patch. I've then got a folder with choir. The times I use a choir, and then I think I've got some miscellaneous and some rhythm bits and pieces towards the bottom. So those are the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 folders. I also then have a sketch piano, so I can sketch piano 1 and 2, hit the D key to load that, and access to the piano straight away. You'll also notice towards the top, and I'm sure all DAWs will have something similar to this, I've got a tempo track, so I've got instant access to the speeds that I want. I've got a signature track, because not everything is in 4/4 time. We've not touched on time yet, but we will. And I've also got a marker track, which is useful for plotting the various sections, so you can get to them very, very quickly. So that's my template. Like I say, the other video will go into a much more detail as to how this was put together and how I use it, but I would highly recommend using templates. So then we have our template ready. We have a melody, we have some chords, and we've decided on tempo. But where on earth do we start? Well, now we start the orchestration process. If you ask any musician how they start such a process, you'll get many different answers. Some will say, and I include myself in this, I can kind of hear the sound in my head that I'm trying to create. But how do you learn to do that? Well, I would suggest you start to try and listen to music in a very different way. I've been working in musical theatre for more years than I care to remember, and to this day, I still struggle to listen to a song that I haven't heard before and then tell you what the song's about. In other words, I'm not good at listening to words. Without thinking, I'm automatically listening to the music, the backing, what's supporting the vocal. You can do this in all genres of music you listen to. Listen to music used, for instance, in TV advertising, in music that supports documentaries on TV, pop songs. Try and identify what instrument is playing and, more importantly, what they are playing. Now, I'm not saying you will be able to listen to a track and then write down, for instance, what the brass section are playing or the keyboards are playing. But the more you do this, the more you will be able to identify which instruments are playing and whether they are playing rhythmical patterns or melodies. You may, for instance, hear a bass guitar, but then you need to identify whether the bass guitar is just adding depth to the sound or whether that it's been written in such a way that the bass adds a rhythmic feel to the sound as well. If you start by using this technique, using what I would call simpler music, not many instruments being used, you'll then be able to gradually identify what sections of the orchestra are playing what in orchestral music, which is almost certainly going to be a great deal more complex in its writing. What notes each instrument plays is very likely to fall into the following categories: a melody, a counter melody, it may be adding to the harmonic structure of the piece, or it may be adding to the rhythmical structure of the piece, or indeed it could be adding to more than one of these categories. To demonstrate this, I want you to listen to a 16-bar passage of the music that I'm going to play and see if you can identify which sections of the orchestra or instruments are providing which of these categories. I'm not going to give you any clues by showing you what's on screen while I'm playing it, not just yet. Take a listen and remember, you're listening for which instruments are doing what. So that was a relatively straightforward piece. How did you get on? One thing I need to point out straight away, however, and this does happen sometimes, as you can see from the notation we have in front of us, it wasn't a 16-bar phrase at all. It was a 32-bar phrase. It could have been as slow as da-dee-da-da, bum, ba-dee-dee-dee. And later on in the suite, it does slow right down. But this one was quite up-tempo. Ba, bam, 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 bam. Use more bars. We'll talk about timing perhaps in another video. So how did you get on? Well, let's just break those 32 bars down and see what I did. We talked previously about about whether an instrument falls into one of the four categories: melody, counter melody, whether it's adding to the harmonic structure of the piece or whether it's adding to the rhythmical structure of the piece. But instruments, of course, can jump those barriers and play more than one. We start off with a 2-bar introduction from the strings. And if you listen to that, in fact, I'll leave that one playing without anything else. So those spiccato strings, that's an Italian word for a very short string sound. It's actually got a bass, boom, 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 which is adding depth to the sound. But the other part of the strings is playing harmony, it's adding the chords, and it's also giving a rhythmical pulse to it. In other words, what you're listening to there is setting the pace as well as everything else. So for those first 2 bars then, we just had the strings doing their thing. For the next 8 bars, we added, what should I say, I added woodwinds. Woodwinds are long in this instance, and they are just playing the melody. So the next 8 bars after the introduction and then for the next 8 bars I actually added an additional amount of woodwind, piccolo, to give it a little bit brighter sound, and those Albion arranged woodwinds that I talked about before to give it a more fuller sound. Let me just play that again. So we started with just the woodwind on its own for 8 bars, then the second 8 bars is a brighter sound. Listen again. Now a little brighter. So up until now we've got the bass and the strings giving pulse, giving rhythm, should I say, and it's also giving the harmony, and we've got woodwinds playing in unison. Unison is a word where all the instruments are playing the same notes. In other words, there's no harmony involved, so all the woodwinds are playing in unison. But what I've also added at that point is the horn, and if I just solo the horn on its own here, bear with me. Once the melody starts, the horn plays this. Now, you could say that's a counter melody. I wouldn't really say it's a counter melody. I would say that is more adding harmony. And what I tend to do is I know the chord at any particular time that should be played, and it really is as straightforward as playing notes that's in that chord at any one time. Nothing more complicated than that. So I had the strings recorded first, the melody on top, and then all I needed to do was add a horn playing the note at any one time that belongs to the chord at that time. When they're all put together, they sound like this. time for a change. So we're now into our second 16 bars, and this starts off with a solo oboe, one of my favourite instruments. And I talked in the last video about what complements an oboe. I think a bassoon complements an oboe quite well. They both have double reeds. Basically, it's a bassoon is an oboe 2 octaves below, kind of. So the oboe on its own will carry on the melody. But it would sound even better if it was complemented with something else, and I chose the bassoon. Sounds like this together. Now that's more of a counter melody on its own. If we just listen to that bassoon, now, you could say, well, what's the difference between adding a harmony note and a counter melody? That's kind of a difficult question. When I'm writing like this, if for instance, I'd sat in front of a notation software and I knew that real musicians were going to play this, I would have approached this in a very, very different way. But the way I did it this time, I knew that what chord was happening at any particular time, and I was just playing around with the notes that I knew would fit that chord. So we now have the bassoon, we have the oboe, we'll turn that back on again, and we have the strings, we'll turn our strings back on again. And for the final 8 bars, I brought back all the woodwind that we'd had previously. The horns carried on doing their thing as they did before, and it sounded like this. So that finishes the 32 bars. But one added thing just to finish it off, and this sometimes happens at the end of passages, one could add what you could call accent notes. And an accent instrument is usually something to give the sound a lift. It can easily be a percussive instrument. In this instance, it was a glockenspiel. It wasn't playing the melody, but it nearly was playing the melody. So those last 4 bars, the glockenspiel played the following. And we've got our first 32 bars. I want now to play you a much simpler, straightforward piece. We don't have to have the 4 elements of melody, counter melody, something adding harmony and something adding rhythm to make a piece. Now, this particular section was underneath narration, so it didn't need to have a strong melodic content. Take a listen to this. So this time it's much more straightforward. We have our melody, and in this instance a solo horn, and a soft bed of sustained strings underneath, and 1, perhaps 2 accent notes, this time from a tubular bell. And the reason I want to play this is that the more you look on YouTube and look for such tutorials of this, you'll find lots of orchestral people recording fantastic tracks, and it's all singing and it's all dancing, but it doesn't have to be. So don't be put off. As you're just starting, take a melody, take some chords, and it can be as simple as that to make a decent sound. We could take it a level, a step even further, and this time exactly the same melody, but we'll just use strings. just use strings. And I should point out at this point that these recordings use sound effects as well, so you may hear a song thrush here as well, which actually kind of adds to it perhaps. Take a listen. So it's just a melody with the strings, the rest of the strings, a bed of chords underneath it. That's all it is. And I would suggest you start as simple as that. So being able to listen to others' work and identify what section or instruments are doing what will help enormously when it comes to starting your own orchestrations. When you get used to listening in this somewhat different way, you'll soon start to learn, without reading a whole host of textbooks, how orchestrations, however simple or otherwise, are constructed. So now that we've started to listen in a slightly different way, let's now break down one of the other pieces. I mentioned in a previous video about creating a mood, talking about tempo, talking about key, talking about whether it's a major or a minor chord sequence. Having a story to tell, however, having a picture in your mind about what you're wanting to create makes it much easier when you're sitting down with a blank piece of manuscript paper or a new project in your Cubase or DAW. In this particular instance, of course, I had to create an atmosphere for scene or movement number 3, which was when my central character moved to Ceylon, as it was called then. Now, I don't know a great deal about Indian music, even though my partner is Indian and was able to offer some advice. What I did know is that I wanted to create a mood. And I want to show you this piece because creating a mood and an atmosphere through orchestral instruments is not just about having a melody. In fact, there needn't be a melody there at all. And I started this piece, and again, with using sound effects and a drone and playing around with some strings. This is how it starts. We hear the drone. We hear an atmospheric sound in the crickets and a very straightforward chord sequence on strings. This is Ceylon waking up in the morning. We then have the sound of our first Indian instrument. What are those notes? No idea. Wasn't written down. I just pressed notes on the keyboard at the time. But that drone gives us a feeling of suspense before we move into something more rhythmical. And to take us to that rhythmical piece was what's called a transition. And moving from one section to another, you'll hear a lot on YouTube about using transitions. And one of the best transitions, you may have heard it there, was a cymbal. Moves you from one nicely into the next one. Let's listen to that approaching section again before the rhythm starts. And now we just have the strings, etc. And while that's going on, I just carried on playing with that Indian instrument. And now we start using chords. Single notes, descending. playing with one chord and different inversions before the main tune kicks in. So we started with the drone, we started with an Indian instrument playing anything basically. We then added Indian percussion. That sustained note became a rhythmical pulse, and whatever it was, I started using a minor chord in different inversions. Let me just listen to that last section one more time. Same note, and then move around inversions. Descending notes first, now play with the chords. Starts with the main theme. So the point I'm trying to make here is it doesn't have to be all about melody, but having a picture in your mind and creating that atmosphere helps enormously when you're starting with a blank sheet of paper. I said in part 1 of this series that it would be 3 videos. Well, maybe I lied. If I need to apologise, then I will, as it's taken much longer than I expected to cover what I wanted to include in this beginner's guide to orchestration. In the next video then, we'll look at using a chord sequence as a starting point for writing instead of a melody, and how creating a chord sequence first can make melody writing a whole lot easier. We'll do a walkthrough of this ballet sequence and how when you have a chord sequence you can write 2 melodies and then work both melodies into your writing. And finally, maybe we'll get round to some mixing and a mix down. See you next time. Who put this here?